Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cloud Wars Live. The digital revolution is in full swing here in early 2020, and we've got one of our digital all-stars on deck here today. Our guest is Tony Uphoff. Tony, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, Bob, great to see you, and great to be on the show as usual.
Thanks. So for everybody, Tony is the CEO of Thomas, which is the parent company of ThomasNet, a very interesting data-centric platform connecting buyers and sellers in industrial and manufacturing markets. Tony's got his own podcast and has been involved with a fascinating digital transformation of his own at Thomas, a 115-year-old family-owned company that's recently moved full swing into the digital and data worlds. So Tony, as you pull together those different threads, both from your own experiences within Thomas, and I think, as important or more important, outwardly with all those customers, suppliers, buyers, producers, sellers, stakeholders, distributors, you're sitting at a nexus point where you get a lot of insights into what's going on. And I thought that one of the things you wanted to talk about today here early in 2020, kicking off this notion of, we've heard about Industry 4.0 for a while, but you think there's some things coming together that say, this is it, it's time.
Yeah, we always joke, Bob, about the idea that we talk about this stuff and it's going to be the year of, and then, 5 years, well, okay, now this is the year. And a lot of that really has to do with, it's easier to see the big picture of a massive market transition. What's far harder, as you well know, being an historian of this, is to understand when the enabling infrastructure or the enabling applications will come together in a way to bring it in relative orbit. We believe 2020 will be the year that Industry 4.0 really takes off. And let me kind of unpack that with you a little bit and give you a sense of perspective. We've been seeing for about the last 18 months, but accelerating over the last 6 months, an increase in demand for products and services that you and I would think of as advanced manufacturing products and services, robotics, advanced manufacturing systems, additive manufacturing, also known as 3D, printing, things around electronic components of sensors and things that are clearly going to be baked in, if not designed into a larger system, and then converged with a traditional industrial product or service. Now, when you look at that, we think that the reason that's accelerating is with this idea that finally the enabling infrastructure, which is two additional components, the industrial Internet of Things, right? We're now wired enough as a manufacturing economy or industrial economy, but we think the last kind of missing piece that's starting to come together is universal 5G. And that is, in its own way, Bob, I'd compare it back to, if you think back to the 2004, 2005 timeframe, Blockbuster was a big business. DVD sales of movies hit $22 million a year, $22 billion a year. It was twice the size of box office at the time. And streaming was an idea and a concept, but literally people would kind of snicker if you brought it up. Well, it wasn't that streaming wasn't understood. It's just that the enabling infrastructure to enable streaming obviously wasn't. Guess what? You look at today. DVD sales are probably next to nothing. I haven't even looked at them. Blockbuster has one store left. And streaming, everybody is diving into streaming. I kind of think that that's the piece here in this march towards the next industrial revolution, that's going to really let go. And as you well know, 5G just opens up packets of information at volumes that we haven't even dreamed of before.
Tony, you had an interesting thread that you set off on LinkedIn a week or two ago about what are some industries that are going to really feel the impact of 5G. What did you hear back from people on that?
Yeah, it was amazing. So in no rank order, and I learned a ton. You were nice enough to bring your network into the discussion. I had people send me proprietary research and all kinds of stuff. I mean, it was really, really great. Healthcare. So healthcare was probably the one that I think I understood. It's tangential to the industries that we serve here. And where we would serve the healthcare industry is really, most every major medical device company uses Thomas and our thomasnet.com platform to source components or, manufacturers or pieces of what they're building out there. But in that respect, that's how we might connect to the healthcare industry. But to hear about some of the applications, and one is the amassing of volumes of data to understand pathology at a level that we've just not been able to do before, as opposed to, gosh, I think I've seen a case like this before, turning into understanding millions of cases in almost instantaneous, time frames is a huge game changer. Many people believe also in healthcare, it's going to open up the idea to imagine what you and I are doing right now, but to a medical end. That you could be a specialist and I could bring you into something as sensitive as a surgery and have you participate along with me to save someone's life or to alter the course of their health or whatever it might be. So the healthcare stuff was just mind-blowing to me that I thought was really cool. The other, I'm sorry,
please,
go ahead.
No, Tom.
The other one that hit me after healthcare was all of the related things to either smart cities or the idea of, I'll call it both, Bob, electric vehicles, but also autonomous vehicles. And I thought that was fascinating. And I know you have some information on that stuff as well.
Tony, tell me, what are your thoughts here, right? So 5G, as you say, all the indications are it's really ready to come to fruition along with the underlying infrastructure. You've talked on some episodes before about how some of these new digital models allow manufacturing, almost like the barrier to entry for manufacturing, to be lowered a little. The capabilities are much higher. It's not going to be less competitive. It's just you don't have some of those traditional giant physical challenges to it. If 5G takes off in the way that you're describing here, do you think we'll see some companies that had sort of been into manufacturing, got out of it, and are back into it? Will we see some of those changes?
I believe that we will, Bob. And I think I would argue that what we're going to start to see along with this kind of, and perhaps a little buzzy to call it the next industrial revolution, but so be it. Let's use that as a platform to discuss this. I think you're going to see a reimagining, if not a redefinition of what is a manufacturer and what is manufacturing. So to unpack your point a little bit, I think within context of not just 5G, but many of these enabling technologies you and I have been describing. First off, you go back to cloud, right, which is foundational to Industry 4.0 and the digital transformation that's happening here. Simple example, through the magic of services like all the great companies that you talk about, from Google to Amazon to Microsoft, what's starting to happen is basically artificial intelligence as a service. So whereas a smaller company, I would be boxed out of that, Bob. There's no way I could have competed at that level. Well, as a good example, we're a fairly good sized AWS customer. We're actually starting to use artificial intelligence as a service that had we needed to invest on that on our own, Bob, that's the bastion of Facebook and Google and platforms that are much larger businesses than thomasnet.com because they serve a broader consumer audience out there. So I think can I call it the leveling of the playing field? I think there's going to be some of that. I also think we're going to start to see time and place shifting. And what I mean by that is, if I can now start to look at this in different ways, I can start to say, hey, I used to outsource something because at the end of the day, the cost was so much cheaper. But now when I actually look at the cost of shipping, but also the availability of producing this product in proximity to an audience that's going to consume it, boy, now I can start to think about, and could 5G and these other technologies enable, perhaps 5G connected to additive manufacturing allows me to say, well, gosh, I could put a small manufacturing facility closest to our hotbeds of customers. And, we've talked about that on your show before. I think everything you and I are describing is starting to happen. It's not like we're just, we're talking about some bold future state here. But I think, I believe we're starting to call the tipping point in the enabling infrastructure that these things are going to start to accelerate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Tony, it does. And I loved, the broad picture you're painting here. And also you talk about something like AI as a service, right? Not very long ago, that would have sounded like science fiction, or, somebody's trying to sell something that isn't really there. But last month, I was out at Google Cloud. I was interviewing Thomas Kurian, the CEO of the year. And one of the things he described was, he said, hey, 18 months ago, he said, we could have gone into, one of the world's largest retail companies, and we could have explained to them the technology solution lying in front of them. And he said, part of that would have been to say, what you have to do is go out and hire somewhere between 200 and 400 data scientists, and then you have to have them work through this stuff. And he said, we could have articulated the solution, but given them no help in achieving it. He said, today, with some of these things that are developing with AI tools and the as a service model that you've described here, just like with computing power, with storage, that capability in medicine to crunch through a massively different, higher level number of possibilities to find things that are going on. That's one of the reasons, Tony, that I just feel that sometimes our expectations about what the next 2, 3, 5, 7 years could be like are we're underplaying them, because too often we think it's just about, let's take what we did before and digitalize it a little bit, make it a little more efficient. I think there's going to be, as you've described here, this explosion of things never been done before, never thought possible before, and done on a global scale by big companies, medium-sized companies, and small companies.
Look, Bob, as one of your other digital art stars, Sean Amirati, says, as digital transformation hits a point, it'll start to be less about that and more about business model transformation, right? And you and I have touched on this before. I think that's what you're describing. And I think, you have to have that combination of, enabling infrastructure, but also familiarity with the tools and applications. Even as AI as a service and all the other things that we're talking about, it doesn't mean that you don't need to have people that understand how to harness the power of this technology. But as those things become in relative orbit, it is remarkable to me. And we are starting to think a lot about, and talking to our constituencies, our users and our customers too, about what manufacturing is today. I think there is this, as we've touched on before, there's this kind of fascinating misperception of manufacturing in the United States. And some of that's a legacy of a bit of a political football at times. Some of it's a legacy of, the average American is, if you're not involved in an industry like that, it seems kind of foreign to you, and you think it happens outside your shores. You don't walk around seeing, auto factories and all those kinds of things on a regular basis. But what's fascinating about it is not only is it a huge industry, $2.4 trillion, and growing and healthy and vibrant, but if you go down the list of the world's most valuable companies, they're actually manufacturers. Apple's a manufacturer. Google's actually a manufacturer. They manufacture something. Amazon is a manufacturer. Microsoft is a manufacturer. Now, we're redefining what manufacturing means, but in a different era, we would have just said, no, they're software companies. But if you actually look at the business that they're in, I think these enabling technologies are allowing us to rethink, right? What is a manufacturing company? You're starting to lean into something too that I'm fascinated with, Bob, which is, I think it's going to open up capabilities for smaller and medium-sized companies, let alone the elephants are going to start to dance, which we're already starting to see evidence of that. And our mutual colleague, Sean Amirati, says, for them to use their unfair competitive advantages now that they can unleash some of this stuff. But I think as, getting a little closer to home here, I think in terms of manufacturing, two things are going to happen concurrent with this. One is we're going to reimagine what manufacturing is. We have new rock stars. Elon Musk is a rock star. In a different era, he was just bending steel. Today's era, he's bending steel, but he's also creating a tech product that's very interesting. I think it's very much reflective of what modern manufacturing is today. It's very hard to separate the technology from the bending of the steel, if I can use that phraseology. I think those things are inextricably intertwined today. And maybe in my bluster here, I'm trying to define how those things fit together. But I really believe that this is going to be a real impetus and accelerant to the manufacturing industry as we know it. But isn't it ironic that it's coming from a step change in technology that's enabling that?
Tony, as you were describing that and using the term about bending steel, I remembered, and wow, sort of dating myself, but I'm old enough now. I don't mind dating myself. But this was 30 or 40 years ago. The first time I ever heard somebody from General Motors talk about, I think one of their factories was called River Rouge. And they described it as like 1.5 mile long plant, raw materials come in here and a finished GM car drives out the other end. And extraordinary achievement at their time, what was possible there. But just the scale of that now, right, with these new capabilities, new insights, new developments in manufacturing, in design, in the infusion of every sort of formerly enterprise technology, now manufacturing technology and industrial technology, just remaking these things. And in some ways, 30 or 40 years, that wasn't that long ago. I mean, we're not talking about 400 years. This is in a matter of decades, we've seen these industries totally flip upside down. What was possible? What made sense? What was cutting edge? And that to me is one of the most exciting things about this. I think this sense of what's possible every few years. We used to think about, well, this industry will tap out around here. There's no limits anymore to what these companies are going to be able to do. And that's got to be so exciting for the industrial markets that you serve.
I think so too, Bob. And I think, the old cliche of we're only limited by our imagination. As you were talking, I was remembering the famous quote from IBM at the dawning of the PC, where some research analyst came back and said, boy, we think this could be, a nice little product. Maybe it could sell 250,000 units over the course of its life cycle. And I don't know how many PCs are sold every hour, but it's probably close to 250,000. But I think we are limited by our imagination at times of understanding how to reimagine some of these businesses. It's interesting, as you were giving the example of an auto factory. We did a piece and a profile on a Toyota plant, and I apologize for not remembering where in the United States this is. It's somewhere, I think, in the Midwest. They did a $1.5 billion upgrade to all the systems there, all the automation and all the different systems in the plant. Here's the kicker: created 500 more jobs. Wow. Which is really kind of fascinating, where you're thinking, wait a minute, shouldn't we be, So I think also in the spirit of challenging our imaginations, I think we think of these things as zero-sum games, and we get caught up in the, oh my gosh, perhaps jobs are going away, or I'm going to get automated out. And, we talk about that in context of trying to picture a future state of artificial intelligence. Somebody told me yesterday in a meeting that there's an app that you can go on, will my job be automated, right, in the future? I don't want to take it because I know the answer is yes, clearly in my case. But all kidding aside, I think we're limiting our imagination around this stuff. And I think, you and I have talked about this before. It's not blue collar, it's not white collar. These are new collar jobs that are some fascinating fusion of the maker movement and making things with advanced technology. And I think that is what industrial and manufacturing markets are today. And you can hear my enthusiasm about it because it's the market we live and work in, but you can also just feel this energy building of people who it's turning on a creative spark, right? That I think, it's fun to be in a business where you can kind of think there's potential to reimagine components of it, or step into markets you've only dreamed of stepping into, or try things without having to bet the farm. Financially, that, man, if this doesn't work, we're cratering the business.
Yeah, Tony, as we want to sort of segue over into some of your thoughts about the marketing side of what's going on here with manufacturing. But as we do that, as you talk about, blue collar, white collar, new collar, I still have a number of Nehru jackets in my wardrobe, and you're one of the best dressed people I know. Does that sort of catch in with the new collar thing or no
The,
collar?
the only guideline is after Labor Day, not the white Nehru jacket anymore. Okay, you have to go with the darker colors. But other than that, and can I just say personally, for all of your listeners who may not know you as well as I do, I think you wear the Nehru jacket perhaps better than anyone that I know.
Thank you.
Certainly anybody outside of India.
Yeah, I don't see a lot of them around these days. Maybe
Well,
that
not
tells
everybody
me
can
something.
wear it,
I'm
as you
probably
know.
out on the, okay, cool.
Yeah,
I mean, I
yeah,
like that.
yeah.
So that, you know, a marketing segue, everyone, thank you for that very sincere counsel you just gave me there.
I'm here to
So
help.
all this, you know, roiling of what's possible, the fusion in some ways of traditional industrial technology and information technology, there's a lot of things bubbling around here that still needs to get settled out, and perhaps some companies playing in those spaces are either overplaying their hands about what they can offer or misplaying their hands, or just maybe not thinking through pretty clearly what's happening. They're trying to take a model or a philosophy, type of philosophy that existed in the past, but now with things changing so fast, we just can't rely on sort of some cliches as perhaps has happened up
Yeah.
until now.
Yeah, it's interesting. And in our private communications, you can tell I'm throwing a little spaghetti up on the wall here, trying to be a little intentionally provocative because I can feel something's changing. I don't know how to describe it yet. And I know how to polarize it, but I'm not really sure that I can explain it other than to say, I think the gap between the brand promise that companies are attempting to make and the user experience has gotten too big. And so I think it's creating a dissonance. And that doesn't mean companies are stupid or they're bad marketers or any of those types of things. I think something's changing. And I'm a believer in the idea that in the law of physics called threading, right? So in other words, if one thing is true, there's likely a series of things that are threaded or connected to that are going to also be true. And so I look at the level of change you and I are describing. You and I are describing things that 20 years ago, if someone was listening to this conversation, they'd think we were describing an episode of some science fiction television program or something. Today, these things are real, and they're starting to shift the way we think about these things. I don't think, therefore, everything changes. The laws of physics don't change, but I can't help but think that the way we introduce, the way we create awareness, the way we create an affinity around our brands is going to have to change a little bit. Not radically, I'm not saying that suddenly everything's up for grabs and the old ways need to be thrown out. But I'm intrigued. My market watching, radar system is going off in a good way. It feels to me that the narratives with which we've created value with prospects and customers aren't working as well today as they did yesterday. And I don't know what that means yet, but I'm not alone in this thinking, as you well know. Marketing has been disrupted by technology. And as a result, we as the pendulum swings, we've turned around and we've been monkeying with the technology, I would argue, and not actually at the front end of marketing, which is, who are we? Why do we exist? Who are you? Why should I have a conversation with you? Which is the elements of branding and relationship building. So I hate to be so inarticulate about it, but I really think, Bob, there's something in here, and I think it's important for our industry to be having this kind of conversation. And look, deep thinkers, Christopher Lochhead and other folks who really understand this stuff at a very, very advanced level should be the ones wading into this discussion and leading it. But I notice it in my industry because I think they are, by and large, many industrial or manufacturing companies, other than some of the consumer-facing ones, are late adopters of marketing in the traditional sense. And so they're not always adept. I'll give you an example, and not to pick on them. You look at the struggles that Boeing's going through. Now, Boeing obviously has made, or appears to have made, some decisions that were really, really bad decisions. So I don't want to make light of that. But suddenly now, Boeing is struggling to figure out, who are we in today's world? And how do we connect with customers? Because suddenly, some very large customers are backing up and saying, whoa, 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 maybe you weren't who we thought you were, right? And so maybe not the most perfect example, but I do think there's something in here that's helpful for us to understand better.
Yeah, Tony, and I think you're being quite articulate about it. You look at another iconic company, GE, so a phenomenal company, but over the last handful of years, they too have gone through some painful internal reevaluations. Where are we? What works? What doesn't? What do we mean to the outside world? And as you were describing some of those upheavals, Tony, I thought about it. Right? It's in your case, manufacturing technology's been completely turned upside down the last handful of years. Information tech, the tech industry is disrupting the tech industry, the MarTech, the things that have happened there. And then ultimately us as individuals, as consumers, our expectations about what we're going to buy, where we're going to buy from, how we want things done on our terms, that's changed. So that rethinking that you're describing, I think has to take place. It's not confined to the markets that Thomas serves, but I think it perhaps is particularly true there because they're in some cases older. There's been a more traditional way of doing things, but I think, keep hammering away on that, Tony, because this is, there's no victory. There's no upside to some company maybe hunkering down and thinking, geez, if I just sort of sit tight, maybe this wave of change will wash over and I can go back to a little bit of business as usual.
I hope this all ends. One of the things that is, rather than just sit here and throw rocks from the sidelines, one idea is perhaps I could give an example of a company I think is doing a brilliant job of marketing and positioning in the new era, and I think that's Microsoft. So if you go back several years, and not to pick on Steve Ballmer, but when Steve Ballmer was the CEO of Microsoft, and even in his exit address to the company, it was about market share. It was about why they were better than the competition. It was about what they accomplished that the competition didn't over the course of the year, over the course of his history as the CEO of the company. And I think those things were of a different era. That was important, that we felt if we demonstrated that we were number one, that we were better, that was the way that the customer made the decisions. And there's probably some truth to that. And we can all point at that. Look at Satya today, right? Amazon says they're gonna see if they can get to neutral on carbon footprint. Satya says, hey, we're gonna actually get to sub carbon footprint. And here's how. Right? He's talking about customer behavior. He's talking about customer needs. He's talking about partnering. He's not stepping up and bashing the competition. I'm sure he, is just as aggressive as the next person, but the tone of voice out of Microsoft is about technology advancement. It's about customers. It's about innovation. It's not about market share and bashing competitors and doing all that kind of stuff. And that's an easy example to give from that was then, this is now. But I think it's a really illustrative example of, calling Microsoft, an old dog, new tricks. Probably, what is Microsoft now, 45-year-old company or something like that. But I think it's a good example of what I'm trying to explain here. And I think, to your point, some of the manufacturing companies, of speeds, feeds, uptime, faster than the next person, those types of things, I think are still relevant in terms of features and benefits. But I think that broader way, or that more thoughtful way of establishing both thought leadership, stability, relationships, the personality of the company. I'll give you just one other little data point in here that we find fascinating. So every 2 seconds, an engineer or procurement professional, or what's called an MRO, maintenance, repair, and operations, picture somebody running the factory floor at a Tesla factory. Every 2 seconds, one of those people is evaluating a product, sourcing a product, or evaluating a supplier on thomasnet.com. And it gives us this incredible data-driven window into how that process works and the types of things that they're looking at. One of the things that we find fascinating is we have a request for information system that resides on thomasnet.com. Relatively straightforward. I can evaluate and set criteria, and then I can send a direct solicitation to a potential supplier or several at the same time based on my specific criteria. I'm an engineer and I'm looking for a custom manufactured part at this level of volume with these materials. And we, help them kind of match make in the system. When that ultimately results in a sale, so we've been able to, through research, track this back. The last thing, inevitably, upwards of 80% of the time that the buyer looks at before they hit send on that, we call it RFQ, they look at the About Us section on the website of the supplier. They look at the pictures of the people. They look at the factory. They look at, and I always am fascinated by that as a data point. And I think there's a remarkable sense if we still buy from people. Yeah, these are powerful companies, but I think we want to have a sense of who is this? What's the personality here? So again, just not fully formed yet, but I think this idea of we may be signaling that it's time to think through the narrative in a bit of a different way. Maybe it's time of an era of, less hubris, or perhaps maybe it's not hubris. Maybe we need to check whether we're being tone deaf in terms of the needs of the customer, what really interests the customer or prospect. Maybe that's closer to what I'm trying to describe.
Tony, absolutely. Some wonderful thoughts in there, but I think eventually, right, this notion of getting out of our little cocoons that we're comfortable at headquarters, wherever it might be, and to actually go out and say, well, this is what I think is going on in the world, but what do people who are buying and selling really think? And so never before has it been more important that anybody, any job title, any sort of company or industry get out and see what's happening there, because that tells us one thing. And the other side of it is, I don't mean to call it magic in a glib way, but these extraordinary new capabilities that you and I have chatted about for the last half hour of what's possible. So we can't just rely on some customer-oriented perspectives, because often they'll tell us how to make things they already have better, but some blend of what they need, where they're going, what they're hearing, what they're seeing. So just a more open mind to what's going on in the world, combined with that imagination that, as you said, is sometimes just the limit of everything. CEO on down has to be the one driving those cultural perspectives, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to a guy named Michael Ayrton, who's the CEO of a very fast-growing custom manufacturing company, primarily in the plastics area. It's a company called Rodon, and really just fascinating company on many levels. 60-year-old family company, and I was talking to him recently about when he took over the company, and timing is everything. He took over as president and CEO in 2008. And so not exactly, flying into the teeth of a recession and all that kind of stuff. And we were having a similar conversation to the one you and I are having. It was really about the power of relationships in business and whether those are relationships with customers or prospects. And he brought up something I thought was absolutely fascinating that I hadn't thought of, is he said, when I took over, I've been involved with the company for a while, and then I got promoted to president and CEO. And he said, what I did when the financial crisis really started to hit is, he said, I went back to the relationships I had with our bankers. And it was interesting because I thought, you don't think of those as a part of your daily kind of a thing. And he said, I realized, I had worked hard to establish trust-built relationships. We were very transparent with them. They knew everything there was to know about our business. So when that hit, we were the last company that they were going to be overly, restrictive about. And he said, I wanted to make sure, and he said, thankfully we didn't need it, but if we needed access to capital, it was there. And it hit me. I think you and I are saying the same thing, and in good markets or bad markets or things in between. I think having a sense of trust in a relationship, and I guess, how do we do that today? And how do we establish that with the idea of our brand and the way we market our company? I think some of the ways we've done it in the past still apply. I think there might be some subtleties in terms of the lyrics we might use today that perhaps are changing.
Well, Tony, on that, perhaps that'll be a subject for next month's episode of Uphoff on Industry. What do you think?
I look forward to it, Bob.
Tony, great stuff as always. Thank you so much. Tell our fans here about where they can see the Thomas podcast.
Hey, appreciate it. So thomasnet.com is our core platform, and you can have access to our daily email newsletter, Thomas Industry Update. You can also have access to our Thomas Industrial Update podcast. And it also gives you an access to all the different types of information and services that we provide. And as always, Bob, really appreciate you having us on. I always enjoy our conversations.
Tony, thanks. Same here. Absolutely. And my thanks to all of you for listening or watching. Great to have you with us here at Cloud Wars Live, and we look forward to seeing you next time.